Hi, welcome to Yeah Let's Code, a podcast where we interview software engineer to share their entrepreneurial story. And here we are on a special episode. In this episode, I will be sharing the backstory of the podcast, some of the behind the scenes, and also this will be a promo video for the Twitch stream that I will be doing at the end of this week for Saturday, 7th of September 2024, where I will be building a Shopify app from scratch, from the idea, coding the feature for the app, and submitting the app to the Shopify App Store to get approved. I will be sharing all of this live, so check it out. I will be leaving my Twitch profile in the description of this video, and if you are listening to us from streaming platform, you will see the link in the show notes. So in this episode, I will be starting out with the backstory of the podcast, my process for creating a podcast episode, behind the scene of running the podcast. So the backstory of the podcast, I have been thinking about starting the podcast for quite some time, and I have been listening to multiple podcasts like Indie Hacker, Syntax FM, and other podcasts like this one. But often I wish I could ask the guests more beginner-friendly questions and getting more detail about the challenge they face and the behind the scene of being an entrepreneur. And also I would like to invite some guests that are not very famous on social media to get different perspective of entrepreneurship as a developer, because everyone will have a different success story and different definition of a success. And this is where the idea of the podcast came from, and from that I did a special video with Younes Blanklob on my YouTube channel, and from that I call it the first episode. And from that, this is where the start of the podcast have been. So in 2023 I recorded about 3 episodes, and currently in the season number 1 of the podcast we will have about 17 episodes. So currently, if you are watching this, there is already 9 episodes published, and this will be the 10th. I'm pretty excited for season number 1 because I interviewed some amazing guests. I had the pleasure to host them in my podcast. So we covered the detail for the backstory of the podcast, and let's move on to my process of creating a podcast episode. So for the first couple of episodes, it was a bit hard for me to be able to invite guests because no one knows about my podcast, but because of I was part of the Shopify dev community, it was a bit easier for me to get someone from the Shopify dev community as a guest in my podcast. And from that first couple of episodes, the podcast gained some audience, so it was much easier for me to reach out to new guests and have them in the podcast. And I was tweeting about my podcast for quite some time, so people already know that I am working on this project, and I am really excited to work on this project. And for the process of inviting the guests, I usually contact them over Twitter. So I give introduction about the podcast, and after that, if he agree and he interested being a guest in the podcast, I send them a calendar link, and from that we set up the podcast recording session, and from that we start recording the podcast. I am using Riverside.fm for recording the podcast remotely, and it's been really good for me because I don't lose quality because it will be remotely recorded. So all the recording will be done locally. While we are recording the podcast, it will also upload them. If there's like some video call issue, this is not be impacted in the final video result. As you can see in the podcast episode, there's no like some technical issue related to the video quality, which is I'm really concerned about, because I would like to get a good quality for the audience so people will enjoy watching and listening to the video. Then I start the video editing part, which is the most time consuming part in this process, because first of all, I recently start using Descript to be able to clean the audio from all the filter word and the silence. For example, all of this word will be cleaned, and after that I will export it as a timeline in Final Cut Pro and start and continue the editing there, where I will be making the template for the podcast video, where you can see all the layouts for the podcast, the background and the intro and stuff like this. And also I will be doing the edits, because this script, it does only remove the filter word and pause, but I have to rewatch the video and make all the cuts myself, which does take time. And also I have to get the highlighted moment from the video to put them in the intro, so people will get interested and hooked to watch the other part of the podcast. And it does take some time. For example, some of the podcasts, there's like a rough estimation, but let's say 2 hours until like a 5 hour. There's like a special one which does take me 5 hours because there's a lot technical issue that happened during recording where skills have an echo, and I didn't notice because we cannot monitor the audio from Riverside directly. It was a bit hard for me to do the edit for this part, and after finishing and exporting the video, I start designing the video thumbnail and the social media clip that will be used on Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter recently. And I'm using the Riverside.fm magic clip generator, which does help me to get all of the key moments that happened during the podcast recording. I edit them and export them. Also, I export them to Final Cut to apply my custom styling to promote the podcast episode. And then I schedule them over a buffer for all the social media platforms like I mentioned, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. And voila, I upload the video to YouTube and to Spotify podcast where I'm hosting my podcast, and it does distribute to all streaming platforms like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music. So that's it for some detail about the podcast, and let's enjoy some behind the scene and some funny moment that happened during the podcast recording. So can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear. Yeah.
Okay.
Did I get lost?
Yep. Just a bit when you mentioned that you never get employed.
Oh yeah, that's what I said. That's where I finished. Like I never got like formally employed by anyone like to do web development.
Like, is the Shopify App Store overcrowded in 2014? 2024.
No.
And the second point that you mentioned about, I couldn't remember exactly, but I think you mentioned a good point, but I couldn't remember exactly the point.
What did I say? The quality of the client. And
if you are not in the Shopify, you will have like no idea about what you are talking about, like especially the meta field stuff.
Yeah.
But yeah, and I would like to thank everyone that supported the podcast and send me a feedback about the podcast. Leave a good rating for the podcast over streaming platform like Spotify and Apple Podcasts. I'm really enjoying making this podcast episode and having all of these amazing guests in my podcast. And also I would like to thank all the guests that accept to be in my podcast, which is really on their early stage. So I am really glad that I can manage to have all of these amazing guests in my podcast. So thank you so much, and see you on the next episode.